Today's video is sponsored by Squarespace. Look, we're all acutely aware that motorsport is typically a sport for the wealthy. It's a shame, but it is kind of true. It's spenny as you like at all levels. Even in karting, high level karting, you're talking six figures a season to run. That's not even in formula cars, it's crazy. But today we're talking about Esteban Ocon, a man who is a clear exception to that rule. Much is spoken of Lewis's rise from pretty humble beginnings in Stevenage, and rightly so, but Esteban's story, for me, is even more impressive. Now, the last time I talked about Esteban at length on this channel was when I was talking about him and Pierre Gasly and how they used to be besties, and now they don't particularly get along. And from that video, the two top comments kind of perfectly summarised the sentiment around Esteban Ocon at the moment. First being, always felt Ocon is an outsider in the new generation crowd. And second being, I don't think many people like Ocon, to be honest. And for the second one, I'm assuming they're talking about the drivers, not necessarily the fans. And as much as I tried to reinforce in that video saying that most of the knowledge we have of their beef comes from Pierre's side, we haven't really heard Esteban's side, I do still feel like I kind of ended up siding with Pierre there. But in scripting this video and just focusing on Esteban's story, I don't know, I feel like this video might change a few minds and maybe make people hold Esteban, including myself, in a bit higher regard than we already do. Maybe. So what are those humble beginnings? Well, Esteban grew up in Évreux in France, which is about an hour and a half drive from Paris. I've actually been through there a couple of times. And he was born on the 17th of September 1996, making him 24 at the time of recording. His father, Laurent, is a mechanic, and it was this early exposure to motor vehicles that planted that racing seed. The family lived above the mechanic shop that Laurent ran, and from everything that Esteban said about his dad, he was a proper grafter. Still is a proper grafter. He would work mad hours just to make sure his family supported. A reality for quite a lot of people, unfortunately. Growing up, Esteban was a huge Michael Schumacher fan, as many of us were from that generation. I was more of a Mika Hakkinen kind of guy, not gonna lie. He used to don a Ferrari set of overalls for a lot of his karting races, and fun fact, that is why Esteban's helmet designs are always red now, because of Schumacher. Now, it cannot be downplayed just how much his parents put their lives completely on hold in order to support Esteban's early karting career. He mentioned this numerous times on the Beyond the Grid podcast that he did with Tom Clarkson, that, his mum and dad just wanted a better life for him than they'd had for themselves. During these early karting years, they all lived in a caravan in which the three of them, plus their dog, Viper, would travel all around Europe participating in karting competitions. And it was all financed by the fact that they sold the family home and the mechanics. 3 years, just the three of them, van, caravan, that was it. That was the team. Everyone else got their big fancy motorhomes with loads of personnel and staff, and they'd just rock up every week, just the three of them. Also, his mum, Sabrina, would tutor him because, of course, when you're a junior in karting, you miss out on a lot of schooling. It's an inevitability, unfortunately. I know Lando's talked about missing a lot of school and childhood in general during his early karting years. But then again, Esteban now speaks like 4 languages, so he's certainly not short on an education. Alright, quick break from Esteban. Time to talk about today's video sponsor, Squarespace. Building and operating your own website used to be something you'd typically kind of outsource to an agency or something. They'd deal with the build, the code, all of the updates, all of that nonsense, right? But I ain't about that life. The idea of looking at a single line of code genuinely gives me terror. But with Squarespace, it could not be easier to build your very own website from scratch on your own, no agency needed. Everything's super intuitive, drag and drop options, inbuilt templates. It is a doddle to build a website that looks proper nice. So you might as well give it a go. Head to squarespace.com for a completely free trial, zero risk. You can play around with all the options, get to know the platform, have a good little fiddle with all the tools at your disposal. Then once you're ready to put your website live to the world, use the discount code TOMMOF1 or give the link in the top line of the description a tap for 10% off your first website or domain. Thank you, Squarespace, and thank you for supporting the brands that support me. Now back to the video. The sacrifice and risk that the Ocons were taking to facilitate Esteban's karting career were significantly bigger than the vast majority of other people competing around him. He said it himself, from Esteban's point of view, it was all or nothing with motorsport. Although his dad did make sure that Esteban helped out working with the kart so that he could train those mechanic skills, because if it hadn't have worked, then mechanics is probably the route he would have ended up going down. I'm not being funny, with just the three of them, I'm sure Laurent was very grateful to have an extra pair of hands to help out. You got to think, surely the weight of expectation and the pressure, because Esteban would have known full well like how much his parents were sacrificing and putting on the line for his career, that must have just lit an extra bit of fire in him that you're not going to get from any other drivers who come from a more privileged background. There's something about graft and coming from very little that loads of professional athletes credit their success to, because they know how bad it can be. Esteban was eventually spotted by Eric Boullier at about the age of kind of 12, 13 and was drafted into the Renault Academy. This of course did massively reduce the financial burden that his parents were under, which was great, but then came a whole new level of pressure where Esteban just, like, he needed to perform, otherwise he'd be dropped. It is that brutal. And then just to wrap up the remaining kind of career progression after karting, by 16 he'd reached Formula Renault, by 18 he'd done Formula 3 and DTM, and then in 2016 at the age of 19 he made his Formula 1 debut with Manor. You know what's mad to think? The 2014 F3 title, he won it ahead of a certain Mr. Max Verstappen, and in a grid that was slammed with talent too. Ocon, Verstappen, Giovinazzi, Latifi, Seti, Camara, Cassidy, I could go on. But because the academy he was racing under, which had become Lotus from Renault, closed at the end of 2014, it was a very real prospect that he was going into 2015 F3 champion with no drive. Fortunately, in 2014 he'd made an impression with a certain Mr. Toto Wolff over that season and was able to secure a GP3 drive with ART, a season he'd go on to win. And of course we know about his time at Force India, and then he went away for a bit and then he came back with Renault. So that's Esteban's journey. But what about the sentiment that people seem to have that he's a bit of an outcast and is maybe not particularly liked amongst the paddock? Is that deserved or not? So people think he's a bit of an outsider, but when you actually look into it, like, surely no wonder. You've got to remember, he's competing in a sport that the vast majority of people participating in it have come from wealth. Since the earliest days of his karting career, he will have been seen as like the poor kid, for want of a better term. Look, I'm purely speculating here, of course, but I think I understand it. Look, kids can be cruel, and there's absolutely no question in my mind that Esteban would have caught some flack in those early days, got teased by other drivers. They're all rocking up in their big motorhomes and fancy overalls and big teams, and he's just turned up with his mum and dad in their little caravan. Kids pick on kids that are different, and Esteban would have stood out. I can therefore imagine that he probably didn't click with the other drivers in the same way, you know what I mean? Like, a lot of them would have been racing for fun, but the increased pressure behind Esteban's situation meant that he must have had a completely different mentality to a lot of the other kids he was racing against. And that pressure probably as well made him overstep the mark, push a bit too hard sometimes. That probably would have come out in his racing at times as well. But again, even at that young age, being so aware of how much your parents are sacrificing to put you in that position, that must have a psychological impact on you. And you know what's kind of ironic, right? Like, it seems that his best mate in the paddock is Lance Stroll, a man who couldn't come from more of an opposite side of the financial wealth scale. But then again, Lance growing up was probably a bit of an outsider as well, but just again for the opposite reasons. All the investment, all of the support, the biggest of motorhomes probably stoked a bit of resentment in his peers at the time, and to be fair, in some people still to this day. In all the interviews I've heard Esteban speaking, he's come across incredibly humble, incredibly grateful, incredibly self-aware of where he's come from. He's a man in F1 who's come from proper working class hardship, and you have to respect that because that is incredibly unusual. Just to become a professional racing driver full stop would have been hard enough, let alone get into Formula 1. You've got to respect it. It's an incredible story. I do come away from this video feeling a lot fonder about Esteban. It's a true like working class underdog hero story. He ticks all the boxes for that, and I love that. And looking at his performances now, again, 2020 wasn't a great start to the season given, but you have to bear in mind it was his first season at the team. He's alongside Daniel Ricciardo, who's in his second season at the team, 7 times race winner Daniel Ricciardo, who I rate just behind Max and Lewis in terms of outright pace for me. It was always going to be a huge task to perform relative to his teammate, and to be fair, by the end of the season, he was getting very, very close, especially in qualifying. I know many are quick to dismiss Esteban with the incoming Fernando Alonso, I understand. 2 times world champion, I get it. But I genuinely believe Esteban has got the minerals to do better than Fernando in 21. I know that's not a popular opinion, but tough. But regardless, 2021 is going to be a huge year for Esteban. Thank you very much for watching. I do appreciate this. Also, I have linked in the description the podcast he did, the Beyond the Grid one, from like 2018. Really interesting podcast. Would definitely recommend you give it a listen if you haven't already. It gives a very human insight into the man. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. I do appreciate it. Notification bell, all that good stuff. My name's Tommo. Thanks again. Have a good one. Ta-da.